everyone, and welcome back to ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Sophia McLeod, and today we've got a special in-between seasons episode for you. On this episode of GCP, I'm joined by three members of ACRO's Risk-Based Quality Management Working Group: Jennifer Stewart, Executive Director of Clinical Data Sciences at Premier Research, Lauren Garson, Senior Director of Clinical Strategy at Viva Systems, and Nicole Stansbury, Senior Vice President of Global Clinical Operations at Premier Research. Jennifer, Lauren, and Nicole are going to walk us through ACRO's recently published paper, Risk-Based Quality Management in Clinical Trials, a Case for Centralized Monitoring, and make a case for increased adoption of RBQM elements in clinical trials. Enjoy. Nicole, Lauren, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today. We're very excited to keep the RBQM conversation going. For our loyal listeners, you will have heard part one of this conversation previously, where we talked about the landscape survey results and sort of how that's evolved over the years. And today we've reconvened this team, well, a new portion of the team, I should say, because you guys just published a paper in DIA Tiers called Risk-Based Quality Management in Clinical Trials, a Case for Centralized Monitoring. We will have a link for those who want to read the paper. We'll have that in the show notes so everyone can kind of get up to speed. But today we really want to hear from you guys directly about what this paper is about, kind of some of the ideals that you've espoused in the paper, and what you hope, the industry can learn from it. And for anyone who hasn't listened to part one, please go back and do that. But we'll start maybe with Jen, and I'll just sort of kick it to you to kick us off. Can you give me the Cliff Notes version of the paper and really what it's about?
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me too. So first of all, risk-based quality management in clinical trials centers on identifying, preventing, and mitigating risks and threats that could undermine patient safety, data integrity, or the process of a clinical trial. And as a part of the ACRO RBQM working group, we've now done 5 years worth of landscape survey. So we've been gathering information about adoption of risk-based quality management across the industry. And as you mentioned, some of our colleagues participated in the first part of the podcast on this topic and give a lot more details about the findings of those surveys. Suffice it to say that 6 or 7 member companies that are all CROs, a part of ACRO, over the past 5 years, each year, 5,000 or 6,000 studies were a part of the sample size, and that included new and ongoing studies. So in those surveys, we've seen over time the adoption of risk-based quality management overall. Risk assessments have become the standard. SDR and SDV have reduced, and centralized and remote monitoring have become more common, but there's still opportunity to shift away from the dependence on SDR and SDV and to leverage central monitoring. So again, if you haven't listened to that first podcast, do that. You'll get a lot more information about the data and the outcomes associated with the surveys, the status of RBQM in the industry today, and also how companies can continue to refine their RBQM approach and effectively and efficiently execute clinical trials. So more importantly about the paper, we're looking at how risk-based approaches are being used in clinical trials, in clinical trial monitoring specifically. And we've found that sponsors are still reluctant to adopt central monitoring and instead are still depending on SDR and SDV, and in a lot of cases still doing that 100% of the time. So our paper is trying to make a case for why we should leverage central monitoring, shift away from that dependence so much on the transcription checking and that 100% on-site activity. And so we did a case study to walk through central monitoring, how it could be applied, what the benefits are, and for example, identifying issues that can be flagged in near real time instead of after the fact.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's so interesting how you guys have been doing this for so many years now, to see the trends over time and then kind of look at each year specifically what we're seeing in that year. It's a really great project. So I think this is really lovely to have you guys here to talk about it. Nicole, Jen mentioned that case study. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the case study that you explored in the paper and sort of how you guys approached it.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we started with was, let's get a real trial. Let's talk about a real trial. So we went to clinicaltrials.gov. We found a study that included a protocol synopsis. It included a description of primary safety and efficacy endpoints. We had some key eligibility criteria and a brief description of some of the visits and procedures. One of the things that we did was we wanted to simplify it. We wanted to make this something that is easy for people to interpret and then go try and apply on their own. So we simplified the study design and the eligibility criteria a little bit for the purposes of the case study. We made some assumptions on the schedule of events and how data would be collected. That was an important part of this, because we wanted to demonstrate how this works where data is captured from multiple electronic sources. Okay, we know that studies are getting more complex and data is being captured in many more ways. And so that's one of the things that sort of caused us to need to talk about central monitoring in particular, is to show when data, especially in cases when data is captured in multiple sources, these are the types of studies that could really benefit from a central monitoring approach. So we did that. Then we went through, once we had simplified that, we got our team together. And our team is a very diverse team. We've got people in clinical, we've got data management, we've got sort of a wide breadth of people, including people from technology companies. So we had a really good cross group of people that could take a look at this and make a recommendation or assessment on the risk. So the first thing that we did was determine critical data and critical process. We identified risks to critical data and critical process. So everything that we preach and tell people to do all the time, we actually went through it and did it ourselves as a group on this study. It took us a couple of meetings, but it wasn't a very difficult or challenging exercise. I think we were very aligned in doing that, but we really went through the process just as we would expect a project team to go through to come up with this on their specific study. And then we started to, once we identified the critical data and critical process and the risks to those, we started to talk about the most effective ways that we can mitigate those risks. What can data management do in the form of edit checks? What can we do? And we focus primarily on the central monitoring. What can we do from a central monitoring perspective? How can we aggregate some of this data together from different sources and put it in front of a central monitor so that they can be that first party to identify any issues or risks? And then how do we pass that information on to the next group? And then the last part of this that we did was looking at developing an SDR and SDV sampling strategy that relies on first that central monitoring to occur so that we can see how this sort of layers onto each other nicely. So once we identified our critical data, our critical process, our centralized monitoring strategy, and then our SDR and SDV sampling strategy, we took it even further. We went and defined what we thought the key risk indicators would be used in this particular case study. We came up with quality tolerance limits. So I know that has been a big question for people, is what the heck are quality tolerance limits? And give us some examples. So we put that together. And then we even went a step further and showed some visualizations of what those central monitoring visualizations might look like and how they can be used to identify things in the data that will not be recognized by the naked eye by a CRA in the field. So I think the paper's got some really good elements in there that bring this to life, that really make this something that people can envision what a methodology might look like, and then easy for them to try and go adapt for their particular trial. So that was really the purpose of this, was to demonstrate how we can look at the benefits of central monitoring, combine it with a reduced SDR SDV strategy, and how we can fill those risks and in the execution of the trial in an effective way, with the goal to monitor patient safety and data integrity throughout the course of the trial. That was an important part, always making sure that what we were doing was an efficient and effective process, but always keeping the patient and the data integrity at front and center.
Yeah, I think that case study piece is so interesting and really kind of helps, bring it into the real world in a sense for folks as they go through the paper. Obviously, a huge part of this is to share what you guys are learning, and we want to see that industry adoption. So maybe Lauren will ask you, and then Nicole and Jen, please feel free, chime in. But how are you hoping that sponsors and CROs and others in the industry use this case study and the learnings from what you guys have kind of gathered through this process in their own organizations?
Great. So I think you've heard from Nicole and from Jennifer that the purpose of the paper, the landscape survey itself, and the purpose of all of the work that we're doing is really to promote the use of RBQM, specifically reduced SDV, SDR, and the use of centralized monitoring across all studies. And we use the case study to help sponsors and CROs by giving them like a starting point or a template for use in their own companies. And when I promote the use of RBQM in my daily life in clinical trials, I think sponsors and CROs are wary to apply the principles because they want evidence that they work. So the word risk in risk-based quality management gets misinterpreted as increasing the risk of a trial, as opposed to what it's really there for, which is managing the risk and therefore lowering it. So I always get asked, can you give me an example of a study where those principles were used and the quality was maintained or even improved? So I think the case study highlights a good example for that. So I always respond that there is nowhere in the regulations that say you need to do 100% SDV or SDR. It has just been done as a standard practice. Now regulators are saying to reduce it and use the RBQM principles to focus your time and your energy on the higher risk areas, and companies are still wary to adopt it. So we also get asked, how do I start? So in the paper, we're giving you a starting point. There are specific examples of how we would assess the protocol for risk and how to mitigate those risks. You heard a little bit more from Nicole that we create sample data and sample visualizations to highlight the benefit of a risk-based approach, and also those sample KRIs and QTLs for this case protocol as well. And also, finally, the SDR and SDV patient visit sampling strategy. So we hope that by seeing that specific case study, that sponsors and CROs who have not fully adopted RBQM have a way of managing their trials and will be more apt to do so. So as we say in the paper, we believe that the clinical trial industry has an obligation to utilize centralized monitoring to produce more efficient and effective clinical trials. And we believe in this paper that we have made a case to do so.
Lauren, I think that's great. You made a good point earlier about how you ask for examples, right? Because this misinterpretation of the word risk sometimes makes people fearful of implementing or changing their strategy. Something that was also mentioned in part one of the podcast was, I think Chris mentioned it, that it's almost like we have to prove a negative, right? So, or she gave an analogy to suspenders plus a belt, right? We don't need both of those things to keep our pants up, right? It's really about outcomes that show that there were fewer issues, right? So it's hard to show that we are actively producing something. We could say, all right, leveraging central monitoring, we identified an issue faster or something, right? But a big part of this is that we aren't having to redo work. We aren't having to change our enrollment plans. We aren't having to do some of the things that have kind of become standard under the older way of doing things. And instead, we're catching potential risks and threats as we go. We're course correcting. And therefore, back to this efficiency and effectiveness concept, right? We are optimizing, we're leveraging the time we have, we're optimizing the process, we're keeping the data integrity and patient safety in mind, and we're really overall delivering in a better way using central monitoring than maybe the days of old where we had a lot more dependence on on-site activities.
I think another important thing to keep in mind is that, we often get pushback from sponsors and to Lauren's point, in fact, sometimes they'll say, we don't need central monitoring because we've already made the decision to do 100% SDR and SDV. They don't want to add it. And I think the challenge and the recognition that people need to begin to acknowledge is the complexity of trials today. We're collecting data from multiple data sources. It is millions and millions of data points. Like, used to be 1.5 million data points. Now it's like 3.5 million data points, according to studies from Tufts. There is no way that traditional CRAs in the field, going into a medical record, then going into lab reports, then going into EPROs, then going into other wearable download systems. I mean, the data is in too many places for us to make the logical connections across that data the way that data is captured today. It is impossible. Central monitoring is not a nice to have when you've got multiple sources of data. It is an imperative. You've got to have that so that data can be aggregated. This is not about remote monitoring versus central monitoring. We're not doing monitoring the exact same way we did in the field, but only sitting at our desk. That's not what we're talking about here. We talk about central monitoring. With central monitoring, we are really talking about aggregating the data from all those different data sources and creating a visualization to put in front of the person that's doing the monitoring and helping them to find the deviations, manage compliance, look at patient safety trends in a way that is absolutely impossible to do, even when we had only 1.5 million data points in a trial. But now we've got multiple sources, and it becomes an imperative. And that's, I think, a big difference. I think the other thing that we wanted to highlight in this paper is that, even central monitoring 10 years ago, when we first started talking about it, we were doing it more at the study level, looking for statistical anomalies and trends. And one thing that you heard all the time back then was, well, the study is really small and it's a small number of sites and it's a small number of patients. So we really don't need central monitoring because, we feel like we can see the trends, and we don't need the aggregation of that data. But today, even within an individual patient, there is still a lot of data. And again, it's in multiple sources. So I think when we look at how we can use central monitoring to do patient level data, not just the study level anomalies that are coming in, I think it really is a better way of accomplishing that patient level monitoring that occurred in the field and doing that centrally. So I think you'll see in the paper, we'll talk about different methods, but we need to make sure that there's truly an understanding of what we're talking about when we say central monitoring, and that we're not getting it confused with just remote monitoring. It's very different. It's about aggregating the data and recognizing the complexities and the volume of data from different sources that are facing CRAs in the field today.
I mean, if anyone's gonna, make this the norm, I feel like it's you guys. You guys are really waving the banner, flying the flag. I don't know what the right term is, but you're doing really great work. So I think it's great that, like I said at the top, that we're doing another year of this paper and the data collection. I think, really being able to show what's going on the ground is just really interesting the way you guys are pulling that out of these papers. So again, love having you here. I want to wrap up on a little piece of advice type question. And I'll ask all of you for your thoughts. Maybe we'll start with Jen and then Nicole, and then we'll end on Lauren. I think that works. But if you guys could leave people listening to our episode today with one piece of advice on adopting centralized monitoring, what would it be?
Sure. So I say focus on what matters. So trust the research. Studies have shown time and again that data doesn't change that often after it's entered or after it's gathered. Transcription checking is not time well spent. Instead, identify the critical data and process, leverage the technology, do that aggregated, centralized review, and aim your efforts there. You will get a lot more fruit for your labor in that way.
I would say give it a try. You've got to give it a try. You've got to start. Each organization, I think, is obligated to start defining their own benefits and ROI on implementation of these things. I don't think it's an easy place to say anymore, well, we're just going to do SDR and SDV at 100% and that's how we're doing it. Because if you're still doing it that way and that's how you're guaranteeing quality, you are allowing a lot of human error to get in the way of just how the data is presented. It's just not the best practice. So I think it's on each of us to really make sure that we're giving it a try.
And I guess I'll end it with, if you really are still wary of where to start, there's just so much expertise out there and so much collateral out there that you can search for, including, the information that we provide. But we really feel like it's an imperative that this is the correct way to move, and not just to reduce effort. It really is there to improve quality and improve patient safety. So if you haven't started, the time is now.
Awesome. That was fabulous. Thank you all. This has been really fun. It'd be great to have you all on again. This has been a really fun conversation. Thank you for joining me. And I hope everyone listening enjoyed and learned something as well. And everyone reads the paper, which is once again linked in the show notes for you all to access, and also on the ACRO website. Thanks so much for tuning into this special episode of ACRO's Good Clinical Podcast. Once again, you can find the RBQM paper linked in the show notes and on ACRO's website. And I'll see you very soon for season 3.